You can be erased from the center of your own life if you don't learn when to say enough. It was supposed to be temporary. Just a few weeks. That's what Grace told herself as she stepped through the front door of her son's home. A suitcase in one hand and a heart full of hopeful resignation in the other. After all, she wasn't there to impose. She had helped them buy the house. 49% ownership. Her retirement money. Her name was still on the deed. It was supposed to be a place of shared beginnings, family, roots. But that night, as the front door closed behind her and Rachel flashed a strained smile, Grace knew something had shifted. There was no welcome hug, no warmth, no sense that her arrival mattered. And then came the moment she'd never forget when Lorraine, Rachel's mother, walked proudly from the master's suite, her perfume trailing behind her like an exclamation mark. And Rachel pointed at the couch in the den. No privacy, no room. Just a folded throw blanket, the price tag still dangling like an afterthought. Grace stood frozen. "This is where I'll be staying." Rachel nodded casually. "It's temporary, Grace. You'll be fine." Temporary. That word again, sharp, like glass in her throat. Before we dive deeper into Grace's journey, her heartbreak, her awakening, and her breathtaking transformation, don't forget to support stories like this. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe every woman deserves respect, no matter her age. Let's bring light to the silent voices. Grace hadn't always been silent in her younger years. She was fire, a mother who worked 2 jobs, survived an ugly divorce, and still packed lunches with handwritten notes for her son. Her hands bore the marks of love from the garden soil that stained her nails to the calluses from cleaning other people's homes to pay for Daniel's college. She'd never wanted applause, just respect. She gave Daniel everything. And now, in return, she got a sofa with a throw blanket and a smile that never reached Rachel's eyes. The first few nights, Grace didn't sleep much. The cushions were too soft, the blanket too thin. And Lorraine's laughter upstairs, sharp and unbothered, echoed through the walls like a cruel reminder of who had truly been chosen. Grace tried to make herself small. She offered to cook. She folded towels. She watered the plants and complimented Lorraine's exquisite taste in linens. She told herself this was what being a good mother looked like. Sacrificing comfort, staying grateful, waiting her turn. But something inside her had begun to ache, not in her bones, but in her spirit. An ache that whispered, "Isn't what you deserve." It started with the small things. Rachel would correct her constantly in front of guests. "No, Grace, that's not how we load the dishwasher." Actually, Lorraine prefers sparkling. Water in the fridge, not still. Grace became an invisible guest in her own investment. A stranger in a house she helped create. Daniel. He avoided confrontation like it was contagious. "Let it be, Mom. She's under a lot of stress. It'll get better." But at Dan's single quotes, it got worse. One morning, Grace reached for the coffee pot and found a post-it on it for family use only. Her hands trembled. Her eyes burned. Family as if she wasn't. She stopped speaking unless spoken to. She started writing instead, late at night. Only the soft blue light of her phone and the hum of the refrigerator for company. Grace began documenting everything in a digital journal. Dates, comments, treatment, moments of subtle exclusion, and open disrespect. Not to plot revenge, not yet, but to understand, because something was happening. A shift not just around her, but inside. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being erased. One Sunday afternoon, Rachel hosted a garden brunch for friends from her yoga circle. Lorraine sat regally at the head of the table while Grace, who'd helped trim the lavender bushes the day before, was offered a folding chair on the side. The conversation flowed around her like a river she was not allowed to touch. And then, as if on cue, Rachel said, "Lorraine's been such a blessing. Truly, she's like a second mother to Daniel." Grace flinched. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, she's really made this house feel like a home." A home. Grace smiled politely, but her stomach twisted like a rag wrung dry later that evening. Alone on the couch, her back aching and her heart hollow, Grace clicked open the folder she'd been building on her laptop. It had a name now, the Quiet Proof. And that's when she opened a second document, her property agreement, her name, her rights. She stared at the text for a long time, as if reading the truth for the first time. She wasn't powerless, she was just exhausted. From pretending to be. The next morning, Grace woke up before anyone else. The sun hadn't yet broken through the curtains, but something in her chest pulsed like a quiet drum. She stood slowly, stretching her stiff limbs. The familiar creak in her knee, the pop in her shoulder, signs of a body that had carried decades of sacrifice, reminded her of one thing: she was still here. She walked into the kitchen and made a cup of tea. Not coffee, not after the note, just plain chamomile. As it steeped, she opened her notebook and wrote 4 words at the top of a new page. Start acting like it. That day, she didn't offer to clean. She didn't make polite conversation. She didn't try to make herself useful. She sat on the porch with a blanket across her lap and read for hours. Lorraine passed her twice with a puzzled expression. Grace didn't look up. When Rachel asked, "Could you make that chicken salad again for lunch?" Grace smiled sweetly and replied, "Maybe another day. I'm resting today." It was small, but it was a beginning. Over the next few days, Grace started paying closer attention. Not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. The silences at dinner. The way Daniel avoided eye contact when Lorraine undermined her. How Rachel monopolized decisions from grocery lists to backyard decor as if Grace didn't exist. One evening, she overheard them talking in the kitchen. They didn't know she was awake. "I think it's time to ask her to contribute to utilities," Rachel whispered. "She owns half the house." Daniel muttered, unsure. That was years ago. Things change. She's not really involved anymore. Grace sat in the dark, her tea cooling in her hands. Not involved. The words rang in her ears. She had put her name and nearly every dollar she had into this house. And now she was being discussed like a burden, a mistake. That night, Grace opened her laptop and began researching. Not just housing rights, not just ownership laws. She looked into elder housing alternatives, options for legal notices, and how to formally reassert property rights without litigation. She read for hours. She took notes. She even made an appointment with a legal aid through a local nonprofit. What she learned shocked her. She had more power than she thought. A week later, a letter arrived, addressed to her. Not from a friend, from a real estate agent. Rachel had quietly contacted someone about a possible refinance without her. That was it that night. Grace printed a letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual, clear, and polite in the most devastating way. It read, effective immediately. "I am exercising my rights as 49% owner of this property. This includes full access to all rooms, shared decision-making authority, and access to financial records. Additionally, I am initiating a formal review of living arrangements and potential partition of property. You have 30 days to vacate or present a written proposal for alternative arrangement. Sincerely, Grace Alcott." She slid it under Daniel and Rachel's bedroom door the next morning. No one spoke at breakfast. Lorraine didn't come downstairs at all. Rachel's face was pale, her lips tight. Daniel stared at his plate. "You're serious," he said quietly. "I am," Grace replied. "I've been serious for a long time. I just stopped pretending I wasn't." That week was a war of silences. Rachel tried to play kind, overly kind. "Would you like us to switch rooms? You can take the guest room upstairs, Mom." "It's been nearly 3 months, Grace said calmly. "Now you're offering." Rachel said nothing. Lorraine whispered accusations under her breath. "She's lost it. This is elder revenge. You should see someone, Grace." Grace smiled. "I already have. A lawyer." Word spread in the neighborhood. Rachel, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, began a smear campaign telling neighbors Grace was mentally unstable, that she was suffering memory lapses, paranoia. But Grace had anticipated that. She had clean paperwork, verified notes, medical records, and even voice memos she'd started taking in the final weeks. One of those memos? A full recording of a conversation between Rachel and Lorraine discussing how to nudge her out. Without legal confrontation, the final nail. When Rachel and Daniel tried to file a petition to delay the notice, Grace responded through counsel with calm but irrefutable evidence of ownership, mental clarity, and intentional planning. The petition was denied. What surprised Grace most wasn't how fast things moved after that, but how clear everything became. Rachel tried to offer her a buyout far below market value. Grace declined. She proposed instead a formal partition, physical separation of the home into two rentable spaces. She would rent her side and already had interest from a travel nurse relocating to the area. "You can't be serious," Rachel snapped. "You wanted me invisible," Grace replied. "Sway, you won't have to see me at all." Daniel finally spoke, a tremor in his voice. "Mom, you're breaking this family." "No, Daniel," Grace said, her voice steady. "I just stopped breaking myself to keep it together." By the third week, Ava, her granddaughter, began texting more often. She was quiet, careful, but Grace noticed the shift. Ava had always sensed things, even as a child. And now she was reading between the lines. "Grandma," she wrote one evening, "I'm proud of you. I don't understand everything, but I'm proud." Grace stared at the message, tears welling in her eyes. It had been a long time since someone said they were proud of her. The 30th day was approaching. Grace had repainted one side of the house, soft sage and cream, and installed a new lock. Rachel had begun moving furniture out of the master suite. Lorraine was nowhere to be seen. Daniel stayed in the garage most nights, tinkering with old tools, saying nothing. Grace didn't need apologies. She just needed space. Not physical space, but emotional space. The kind that allows a woman to breathe again after being suffocated by politeness, manipulation, and silence. She had taken it back, and she wasn't letting it go. The morning of day 30 arrived with a silence that felt different, not heavy, not hostile, just ... settled, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Grace stood by the window, sipping her tea, no longer chamomile, but bold black Darjeeling, a choice, a statement. She wore her deep blue cardigan, the one she used to save for nice occasions. Today felt like one dot. At 9 a.m. sharp, a locksmith arrived, quiet, efficient. He replaced the locks on Grace's side of the house without question, working off the signed partition agreement she now held in her name. By 10:15, the deed was done. She stood at the doorway as he left and breathed in. It smelled like wood polish and lemon oil. Her space. Her rules. Rachel and Daniel had already moved most of their things to the front section of the house. Lorraine had left days earlier without a word, her car gone from the driveway, her scent of talcum and judgment fading from the walls. Grace didn't celebrate. She reclaimed that afternoon, opened every window, let the breeze flow through her side of the house. The curtains danced in the wind like ribbons. She pulled out the dining set she'd stored in the garage, the one her husband bought decades ago before he passed, and placed it in the sunniest part of the kitchen. Then she sat and she wept, not from sadness, not even from relief, from the sheer release. The way a woman cries when she realizes she's not broken. She was just buried under layers of expectation, manipulation, erasure. And now she was rising. 3 days later, Ava arrived with 2 bags and a tentative smile. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart." Ava had asked if she could stay for the summer while she interned nearby. Grace had said yes without hesitation. She knew Ava needed space, not just from her parents, but from the noise of everything else. That night, they cooked together, pasta with fresh basil. Ava chopped. Grace stirred. They talked about music, college stress, books, the absurdity of life. Not once did Ava ask about what happened. But she did pause, halfway through eating and said softly, I always knew you were strong. I just didn't know how strong. Grace looked at her granddaughter, eyes wide and clear. It's not about being strong, Ava. It's about remembering you're allowed to take up space. Ava nodded, tears in her eyes, as summer unfolded. The house blossomed. Grace planted sunflowers in the backyard, bold, tall things that turned toward the light. She painted the back wall of the kitchen a soft lavender. She installed bookshelves and filled them with poetry, memoirs, and cookbooks. Ava added her own art books, sketch pads, graphic novels. They lived gently, with music playing in the afternoons, the scent of cinnamon rolls or roasted garlic floating through the air. Grace found herself laughing more, even dancing a little. She caught Ava recording her once, humming while stirring a pot of soup. Don't post that, she warned mock stern. Too late, Ava grinned. But Grace didn't mind. She was becoming visible again to the world, to her granddaughter, and most importantly, to her herself. Meanwhile, Daniel remained distant. He'd knock on her door sometimes, dropping off mail or leftover groceries from a shared delivery. Thanks, Grace would say, offering a faint smile. You're doing okay? He'd ask, never quite meeting her eyes. I am. He never apologized, and Grace never asked for one because she'd learned something powerful in the silence. Closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes with peace. Rachel tried once more, mid-July, to reach out. Left a note in Grace's mailbox. Can we talk? I think we both made mistakes. Maybe we can reset. Grace read it twice. Then she walked it over to the trash bin and dropped it in without a word. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. Not out of spite. Out of self-respect. By August, Grace had signed a rental agreement with a traveling pediatric nurse named Selena. Young, cheerful, with kind eyes and too many books. She'd be moving into Grace's side of the house for 3 months. Grace would be traveling a writing retreat in Oregon, followed by a visit to an old friend in Santa Fe. Ava helped her pack. Wait, you're leaving me with my parents? She teased. Grace winked. It's just long enough to remind you why you moved in here in the first place. They both laughed. The truth was, Ava had grown too. She walked taller now, spoke firmer, set boundaries with Rachel, even with Daniel. Grace had watched her granddaughter bloom like the sunflowers out back, no longer bending in the shadow of someone else's control. Before Grace left, she stood in the hallway between the two halves of the house. One side bright, alive. The other quieter, older, stuck in the past. She didn't hate them. She pitied them because she had finally understood something vital. Those who try to dim your light are usually afraid of their own darkness, and Grace. She had stepped into the light. No shame, no fear, no apology. Her last night before the trip. Grace and Ava sat on the porch sipping iced tea. You know, Ava said, I used to think growing older meant becoming invisible. But watching you, it feels like you've never been more present. Grace smiled. That's because I stopped waiting for permission to exist. A long silence followed. Then Ava whispered, I think I want to be like you when I'm older. Grace took her hand. No. Baby, be like you. Just don't forget to take up space while you do. Grace arrived in Oregon to the soft hum of pine trees and the hush of wind through the mountains. The writing retreat was nestled between a lake and a grove of redwoods, quiet, serene, untouched by the noise of judgment or memory. She hadn't written creatively in over 30 years. But on the second morning, she opened her notebook, pen trembling in her hand, and wrote, I was never fragile, just quiet. There's a difference. The words flowed, not all at once and not always easily. But they came stories, fragments, truths she'd swallowed for decades. She wrote about love and betrayal, about the ache of silence, about Loren's gaze, Daniel's retreat, Rachel's sharpness. She wrote about Ava, about hope, about what it means to begin again when the world tells you you're too late. She wrote about herself, and in doing so, she found her voice again. Each evening, the group would gather by the fire, reading aloud bits of their writing. Grace listened at first, too shy, too uncertain, till one evening, after a quiet dinner of lentils and wild rice, a woman named Mira turned to her and said, "Gently, I want to hear you. Your silence is beautiful, but your voice is needed." Grace read. A short piece, just 2 paragraphs, about a couch, a blanket with the price tag still attached, and the moment a woman decided she would never again sleep where she was. Not respected. When she finished, the silence was thick. A few people blinked tears away, then applause. Not the loud kind, the kind that comes from the soul. Slow, steady, reverent Grace. Looked down, heart pounding. She had been seen. Back home. Ava kept the house alive. She watered the sunflowers, changed the sheets for Selena, cooked simple meals. She even added a framed photo to the kitchen wall. One of her and Grace laughing over a burned batch of muffins. Rachel noticed one afternoon. She cornered Ava in the hallway. "I hope you're not letting her poison you against us." Ava didn't. "Flinch, she didn't poison me. She protected me." "There's a difference." Rachel narrowed her eyes, but Ava walked away. Boundaries had been drawn. And this time, they wouldn't be erased. In Santa Fe. Grace visited her college roommate, Diane, who now lived in a cozy adobe home filled with color. Plants and cats with too many names. They talked late into the night about lost husbands, aging bodies, and all the things no one warned them about when they were 20. "I thought I'd be invisible by now," Grace admitted one evening, sipping red wine under the stars. "You are," Diane said with a grin, "two people who never learned how to really look." Grace laughed. It felt good to laugh without weight, without apology. When Grace returned home, the seasons had changed. The sunflowers had dried into statues of golden memory. The air had cooled. The leaves had begun their slow tumble toward earth. But inside the house, warmth radiated. Selena had added lavender to the entryway and left a welcome note on the table. Ava had baked pumpkin bread and played soft jazz from the speakers. Even Daniel, on the other side of the wall, seemed to tread more quietly. No longer stomping. No longer slamming doors. Grace unpacked, hung her coat, and stepped fully into her life. She received a letter in the mail from her lawyer the next day. The updated will had been filed. Ava was now a partial heir, alongside a housing justice nonprofit that Grace had long admired. Rachel's name had been removed, not out of revenge. Out of clarity. Grace had realized something during her time away. Inheritance is more than money, it's legacy. It's who you trust to carry your name when you're no longer here. And Rachel had forfeited that trust long ago. Later that week, Ava found a bundle of envelopes tucked in a drawer. Letters Grace had written to herself, to the woman who forgot she mattered, to the girl who apologized for taking up space, to the mother who thought silence was strength. Ava read them all, eyes misty. "Grandma, you should publish these." Grace smiled. "Maybe I will." But truthfully, she already had. Not in a bookstore, in the way she lived now. In the choices she made. In the voice she no longer dimmed. That was the real publication, a life rewritten on the anniversary of the 30th day, the day Grace took back her home. Ava planned a small dinner, just the two of them. A roast chicken and a chocolate pie. They toasted with sparkling apple cider. 2 new beginnings, Ava said. To old wisdom, Grace replied. After dinner, Ava brought out a gift, a framed print with words she had designed herself. She took back her space, her name and her story. Grace ran her fingers over the words. She whispered, "Thank you." But Ava shook her head. "No, thank you. It's for showing me it's never too late to become yourself." Later that night, Grace stood in her backyard, wrapped in a soft shawl. The moon hung low. The stars blinked gently. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes sang a quiet lullaby. She closed her eyes and she whispered into the night, "I'm still here." Not a declaration, a confirmation. because the world hadn't ended. When she said no, it hadn't shattered when she took back her keys, her room, her name. In fact, it had finally begun. The first week of December brought a quiet peace to Grace's life, not the absence of noise, but the calming presence of purpose. The house was different now, not in structure, but in spirit. The rooms no longer echoed with tension. The air didn't vibrate with unspoken resentment. It was calm, real, lived in. And Grace, for the first time in years, felt like she belonged to herself again. She repainted the guest room in soft sage green, reupholstered the armchair by the window, replaced the broken porch light that had flickered for too long. These weren't just home improvements. They were acts of reclamation, each task a small affirmation. I am worth comfort. Ava helped her hang new curtains and reframe old family photos. They sorted through boxes of memories, labeling them, discarding duplicates, preserving stories. One afternoon, they found an old videotape of Ava's second birthday, Grace singing. Off-key, Rachel rolling her eyes. Daniel distracted on his phone. Ava paused the tape. Even then, you were doing it alone, she said softly. Grace didn't deny it. But she didn't wear it as a badge anymore either. I did what I could. She said, now I do what I choose. Around town, word had spread. Some called her cold. Others admired her strength. Few neighbors even stopped by with flowers, casseroles, and long overdue apologies for not stepping in sooner. Grace accepted them all with grace, but never obligation, because she had learned something valuable. Forgiveness doesn't mean access. You can forgive someone and still choose never to let them back in, especially when they never earned the return. Rachel, meanwhile, had gone quiet. She sent one letter typed, impersonal, almost like a legal document. I hope you reconsider your decisions. Family matters should stay within the family. You've hurt more than you know. Grace didn't reply because she no longer mistook guilt for love. And she wouldn't negotiate with someone who only reached out when something was at stake. Ava asked, do you think she'll ever change? Grace thought for a long time before, answering, I think. She either face herself or spend her life running from the reflection. Either way, it's no longer my burden to carry. Christmas came gently, just Grace, Ava, and Selena. They cooked together, danced to old jazz records, and opened gifts under the tree Grace had decorated with silver and purple, her mother's favorite colors. Among the gifts, Ava handed Grace a thin, wrapped package. Inside, a mock-up of a book-covered title, The Woman Who Took the Couch and Then the House, by Grace Holloway. Grace laughed a full, free sound. It was a joke, but also not entirely. She placed the cover on her writing desk where it caught the light every morning. A quiet reminder that stories matter, especially the ones women over 60 are told to bury. A few days later, Ava showed her something she'd been working on in secret, a podcast episode. Ava had recorded Grace's story in her own voice, narrating the timeline, the injustice, the strength, and the outcome. She layered it with soft piano music and titled the episode, The Day My Grandmother Took Her Power Back. She wanted to release it publicly, but asked first. Grace listened with tears in her eyes. Not just because the words were accurate, but because they were kind, measured, loving. They honored the pain, but didn't sensationalize it. You have my blessing, she said, that week. The episode went live, and within days it was being shared across platforms by women of all ages. Strangers wrote in, some thanking Grace for her courage, others sharing their own stories of being sidelined, disrespected, or treated like burdens once they turned gray. One message stood out. I'm 64. I've been sleeping on a couch for 3 years in my son's house. I didn't know I had the right to ask for more. Your story made me pack a bag and book a motel for the first night of the rest of my life. Grace read it 3 times. Then she cried, because now it wasn't just about her. On New Year's Eve, Grace lit a candle and wrote down everything she was releasing. The need to be liked, the weight of their silence, the shame of aging, the illusion. That love and loyalty were the same thing. She folded the paper, burned it in the fireplace, and whispered, "Goodbye." Then she wrote a new list. Things she was welcoming: rest boundaries, creativity, joy without apology, connections rooted in truth. Daniel approached her in early January. He didn't say much, just stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes softer than she remembered. "I should have stood up for you. I knew what they were doing wasn't right." Grace looked at him. She didn't respond right away then. "I know, but silence was a choice. I hope you choose differently now." He nodded, not defensive, just present. "Would you ever let me take you to lunch?" he asked. Grace considered it. "Not yet, but I'm glad you asked. Small steps. Not for reconciliation, but for respect." Weeks passed. Grace kept writing. Ava returned to school. Selena visited often. The house continued to bloom, inside and out. One morning, Grace opened her journal and began a new entry. "I used to believe peace was something other people gave you. Now I know it's something you claim. And once claimed, no one gets to take it away." She looked out the window. The sun had just risen, spilling gold across the hardwood floor. And for the first time in her life, Grace didn't just feel strong, she felt free. There was a quiet dignity to mornings now. Grace woke up when the light hit her face, not when someone's footsteps demanded her attention. She brewed coffee slowly, listening to the low hum of the percolator, and sat at the kitchen table with her planner, not to fill it with tasks, but with dreams. After so many years of reacting, she was finally creating. One of those dreams was becoming more tangible every day. The podcast Ava had shared sparked interest far beyond what either of them expected. An editor from a small publishing house reached out, asking if Grace would consider turning her story into a memoir, not for fame, but for the thousands of women like her who had written in. Grace hesitated. She wasn't a writer, not by any traditional definition. But then she remembered something Ava had told her once. Being a writer doesn't mean using big words. It means telling the truth in a way someone else can feel it. And that Grace could do. She set up a writing space by the window, printed photos of her younger self, not the ones from holiday cards or posed dinners, but the candid ones. The ones where she was laughing with her eyes closed, carrying groceries with a baby on her hip, or holding Ava's tiny hand at the beach. "I need to remember her," she whispered one morning, touching the edges of a faded photograph. "She survived so much, I can't waste her story." So she wrote pages and pages, not just about the couch or the lawsuit or the 30-day ultimatum, but about growing up invisible in her own home, about marrying young because it was expected, about slowly eroding under the weight of other people's comfort. She titled the draft, "Second Place, No More." Meanwhile, Rachel was still silent. Not a text, not a call. Just the occasional mutual acquaintance mentioning that she was doing okay or looking for another property. Grace didn't dig. She had stopped trying to solve Rachel's silence or mold herself to fit into it, because Rachel's distance, she realized, wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror, and Grace had finally stopped mistaking someone else's coldness for her own failure. Daniel came around a little more. Not often. Not intrusively. Sometimes he dropped off fresh fruit from the market. Other times, he brought childhood photos Grace hadn't seen in years. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the now, the things that still could be healed. Grace noticed the way his shoulders seemed lighter, the way his eyes lingered. On Ava, with quiet guilt and tender pride, he was trying, and that was enough, not for reunion, but for repair. One afternoon, Ava invited Grace to speak at a community women's event. "You don't have to prepare anything," she said. "Just show up and tell the truth, the way you always do." Grace was nervous, but she went. The room was filled with women, some young, some elderly, some with canes, others with babies strapped to their chests, all with stories folded behind their ribs. She stood at the front, microphone trembling in her hand, and she began, "For a long time, I believed I was too much trouble. Too old, too inconvenient. I was told subtly and loudly that my needs were less important than everyone else's comfort. But let me tell you something, I wish someone had told me sooner. You don't become invisible with age. You become underestimated. And that is their mistake, not your truth. A stillness settled over the room, and then came the tears, the nods, the affirmations whispered from one woman to another after the talk. A woman named Clara approached her. She was 67, recently widowed, and being pressured to move in with a daughter who made her feel like a burden. I've been afraid to say, no, she admitted. But you made me remember who I used to be. I want her back, Grace smiled. You're not asking for too much. You're asking the wrong people. That night, Grace received a message from Ava's friend Selena. She had just accepted a job in town and was looking for a place to stay. Would you ever consider a roommate? Someone quiet, who can cook and bring wine. Grace laughed. She had turned down offers from several renters, unsure if she was ready to share her space again. But this felt different. This felt like choosing, not settling. So she replied, yes. Come home. The house began to breathe again, not with noise, but with rhythm. Selena moved in a week later. They shared stories over dinner, kept to their own routines during the day, and respected the quiet without needing to fill it. For the first time in years, Grace felt like her home was a place of mutual respect, not obligation. The memoir was nearing completion. Grace planned to donate half of any profits to a housing nonprofit for elderly women facing displacement. The other half she'd use to travel, maybe Italy or the Colorado Rockies, somewhere with open skies and long trains. One morning, while editing Chapter 12, she paused. The sentence read, "They gave me a couch. I gave myself a life." She stared at it for a long time, then nodded. That was it. That was the story. On a quiet Sunday, as the wind swept through the sycamore trees outside, Ava returned for a visit. They sat on the porch with lemonade and watched the sky turn lavender. Ava turned to her. Do you think you'll ever forgive them? Grace took a deep breath. I've already forgiven them. Pause. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting them shape the rest of my life. It means I don't let their choices rot inside me anymore. Ava reached over, squeezed her hand. You're the strongest person I know. Grace smiled. No, I'm just finally becoming the person I was always meant to be. The house no longer echoed. It resonated with the sound of keys on a typewriter, with the smell of cardamom and coffee, with the quiet music of two women reading on opposite ends of the living room, wrapped in their own thoughts and peace. Grace had done more than win a battle. She had reclaimed her place in the world. On the 30th day since Rachel and David had left, Grace stood at the threshold of her front door alone. There were no dramatic farewells, no final accusations. They had packed quietly and left without a word, not out of grace, but out of entitlement to bruise to acknowledge its defeat. But Grace didn't need a confrontation. She needed closure. She stepped inside, barefoot on the polished wood floors, and walked through the house like it was introducing itself to her for the first time. The guest room, where she had once been denied privacy, now held plants and soft light. The living room, once stiff and cold, had been rearranged, cozy, lived in, real. And the master bedroom, hers again, not just by deed, by choice, in the closet. She found something she hadn't touched in years, a small velvet box with her mother's necklace. She clasped it around her neck slowly. It wasn't valuable, but it was ancestral. Your story doesn't begin with pain, she whispered to her reflection. It just carried you here. Later that week, she held a small dinner at home, no grand announcement. Just Ava, Selena, Daniel, and a woman named Miriam, one of the ladies from the women's event. A new friend. They laughed over lasagna, shared memories, and toasted to rediscovery. Daniel stayed behind after everyone had left. For a long time, He said nothing. Then, carefully, "I know I should have stood up for you. I was scared. I didn't want to lose what little peace we had in the house. But in doing that, I lost you." Grace looked at him, eyes steady. "You didn't lose me. You just didn't choose me. And now you have to earn a different place in my life." There was no cruelty in her voice, just clarity. The memoir was published 2 months later. It was modest in its reach, but powerful in its resonance. Letters poured in from women across the country, women who had given too much, stayed too long, kept quiet too often. They wrote things like, "I never saw myself in books. Now I do. Thought I was alone. I'm not. You gave me the words I was afraid to speak." Grace read every single one. She replied to as many as she could. One letter from a woman in Oregon named Letty simply said, "They made you feel like a guest in your own life, but you came back with keys." In a quiet moment, Ava asked her, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently? That they had treated you right from the beginning?" Grace didn't hesitate, of course. "But then I think, if they had, maybe I'd still be shrinking, still making myself small so others could feel big." She set down her tea. Sometimes the heartbreak is the invitation. She started teaching a weekly writing circle at the local library. Women gathered with notebooks, coffee cups, tears held in their throats. They wrote about miscarriages and divorces, about second chances and stolen inheritances, about regret and the quiet roar of resilience. One woman, 73, read aloud a letter she'd never sent to her late husband. Another, 61, wrote her first poem, a defiant ode to finally buying her own furniture. After decades of hand-me-downs, Grace didn't see herself as a teacher. She saw herself as a witness, and that was enough. One day, a package arrived. No note, no return address. Inside, a hand-stitched blanket. Not the one with the price tag still on it, but one made with care. Soft, beautiful, patterned with her favorite colors. Grace held it in her arms. For a long time, she knew who it was from. Rachel might never find the words. But this was something Grace didn't call. Didn't write back. She simply folded the blanket and placed it on the back of her armchair, where she would use it every morning. A quiet symbol of wrongs, acknowledged dot of wounds slowly closing there. Was a new painting above the fireplace, a landscape of a single tree in the middle of a wide open field. Not barren, not lonely, rooted, rude, one evening as the sky burned orange and gold. Grace sat on her porch with Ava and Selena. They were watching the sun disappear into the trees. Grace turned to them and smiled. "You know what I've learned?" "What?" Ava asked. "That silence isn't always peace, and that being nice isn't the same as being whole." They nodded, and for a moment, no one said anything, because the kind of healing Grace had found didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be lived. If Grace's story touched something in your heart, if you've ever felt overlooked, unheard, or displaced, then let this be your reminder. You matter. Your story matters. And your strength might just be waiting for you to finally say enough. So don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth. You're not alone. And it's never too late to come home to yourself.